This is Felix's voice in 2018.
여기 우리 구역 District 9.
And this is it now.
Make it right, we make it right.
How did he get from this to this? We're going to take a look into how he learned to use his voice better and display that with Stray Kids as he grew. The biggest thing that came first is he needed to understand how his voice actually operates. And the way his voice actually works, it's a mix of what he has naturally. He's naturally much lower, and he's using that control that he's built up to elevate it almost. We see that all the time when he's talking, but his performing voice is very different from his talking voice. And that comes from understanding how to control it a whole lot better, and that alone took an immense amount of time to learn. Felix's voice comes down to two main things. There's obviously the natural aspect of, well, that's just how his voice is. His voice is kind of naturally more on the lower end, and then also understanding kind of what the structure of it is and how he can control it to get it to that limit and kind of get it to that area where now we see it in the performances. It's very different from when he's actually just talking outside of the performance. A lot of it isn't actually about that he already has a very deep voice. A lot of it comes from understanding how to use it better and utilize it in the song. If he were to just talk in a performance, it would not sound great, and he had to figure that out, and he had to get it to that point where he understood how to control it in the best way possible that it can amplify it. And this is something that Stray Kids or 3racha have been experimenting with more as they've progressed over the years. Because the way they used to record it earlier on is it was just once. It wasn't like they only recorded once and they go with that, but they actually only had one solid take that they used in the song, versus later on they learned about more layering, and they can take multiple different performances that are very similar and very strong and almost like mix them in, where in different songs you'll be able to hear there's obviously the main one that you're going to focus on more, but there's also areas on the side that are going to amplify and expand on that sound. By layering it, it's going to feel much more grand, and it's going to feel like it's much larger than it actually is. So what he's doing actually is he's usually going to rap at two different pitches. There's going to be the main one that we hear most of the time during the song, and then there's going to be a little quieter one underneath that. Just a little bit lower in a tone, but you feel it a whole lot more in the song. It's a very small change, but it feels a lot different. And so what he's actually doing is he's recording it... Dude. And so what he's actually doing is he's not recording it at just the one pitch that we hear personally. He's usually going to record it at a lower pitch as well, where they can layer it in, usually at a more quieter side, but it expands on that deep voice and it makes it feel much more grand, and it hits you a lot stronger. Probably one of the strongest examples of this is MANIAC, one of their most popular songs. In the chorus of it, I think everyone's familiar with the chorus, Felix is almost chanting MANIAC very lowly. Probably the most memorable part of the song is the chorus, and specifically Felix's part, where he's going very low with his voice, but it's not just his voice there. He's also got different recordings around it, where only when he says MANIAC, you can feel it expand around you. This is a big mixing thing where they're putting in different areas of the MANIAC so that it feels like it hits you a whole lot more. Next time you have headphones, I really recommend you listen to MANIAC with them. Just pay attention in the chorus to feel those different areas expanding, because you're really going to only notice it when he says MANIAC. When he says the little words in between and then goes back to MANIAC, you're not going to feel it in between. It's thin again. So it expands only when he's saying MANIAC. And that's what makes it hit you so hard there. So it's really interesting to see them expanding that and working on it as they grow. Another big part of his voice and his actual control of it is being able to keep the same tone even while whispering. And that might not sound super hard immediately, but I mean, if I were to try and whisper and go a little super low, you could hear how my voice doesn't expand very well. It sounds kind of lame. But like, he's not doing that. When you hear him whisper, it's very clear. And that wasn't something that he just figured out immediately. This was something he had to learn and grow on. This was something that he had to experiment with and figure out how to do correctly. Because quite a lot of people will lose their power when they're whispering. I think it's a mix of really what understanding a whisper is. When we think about a whisper, we think, oh, well, we gotta be quiet now. So it's reprogramming the brain to work in a different way simply for performing it better. I've talked about this before, and it's a very unfavorable opinion, I guess. but I don't really care for Felix's part in Victory Song. I don't think it's that good, honestly. I think the biggest thing is what we're talking about right now. His voice there is very thin. It's just one recording, and there's nothing to it. It's very quiet. It's clear that he's still trying to figure out how to use that whispery tone and make it powerful. Because at this point, back in 2019, he didn't really have these large roles of displaying his deep voice in such power. I mean, looking back, this was just their 4th mini album, so they were kind of just figuring it out still. They didn't really know what to do with it. I'm sure that 3ROCHA likely had the idea to have Felix go as low as he can with the song, but they didn't quite understand how to utilize it the best that they could. And we see them utilizing it a whole lot more the following year with God's Menu. That portion, you can actually feel the layering in it, of course, but he also understands how to use that whispery tone and use it in a way that still feels powerful. Because truthfully, it doesn't hit quite the same way without that power. You could go as low as you could. I mean, it might be kind of cool, but it's not gonna leave you remembering it. I think that's the reason that Victory Song didn't take off, but God's Menu did. That's the part where it felt like there was a huge change in that, and you felt that power immediately. Which kind of leads me into the next thing I realized about his voice. More recently, in the past few years, we've been hearing Felix actually singing in quite a lot of songs. But what's interesting about it is his singing voice sounds different almost. It sounds like it's a different person. I mean, you look at his solo songs and you could show it to anyone not familiar with the group or with Felix, they're probably gonna think it's 2 different people. I mean, I certainly did when I heard Deep End for quite a while. It took me a couple of months before I realized, oh, that's just Felix doing all that. I remember searching around to try and find who that other person could be. I looked at who was writing on the song. There was no other performers listed. And it took me kind of a while to just grasp that concept that Felix has such varying identities with his vocals. Because Felix has both of that deep baritone voice, and he's also got the ability to go higher with it and almost bring it into a different kind of tone. He can lighten up different songs, and he can also darken them in certain ways. And it's that kind of duality that allows him to add more texture to the song and bring them to life even more. It's certainly one thing to be able to drop your voice very low, like that's already very impressive, but to also be able to bring it up in a way that you can sing very well and make it sound like different people, it gives the song even more contrast and even more depth to it. Really quick, just want to jump in here. If you've been enjoying the video, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe. I love to make videos about stray kids, and we'd love to have you here. Well, anyways, back to Felix. Now, Felix, when he first started, he certainly didn't have this vocal ability. This is something that he had to develop over the years. He didn't debut as a vocalist. He was more so on the rap side of things. That's not to say he never sang. We do see him sing a couple of times, like in his Glow performance. He's actually complimented for singing very well by JYP. So before he even debuted, he had that groundwork in place to be a singer that can use 2 different voices. Some of the major songs that Felix is being pushed into the center are like Side Effects. That was probably the earliest one of their title tracks that he was at the center of. Obviously there was Victory Song a few months earlier, but that wasn't necessarily a title track. Side Effects was kind of their first chance at trying to weaponize his voice and use it as something that could be obviously a highlight. I think 3ROCHA very much so understood that Felix had something very interesting that they could leverage and use as a weapon, like I said. However, at this time, he was very narrowed in. Obviously his part is certainly quite interesting on its own, but it wasn't quite the contrast they needed for it to excel. His parts were certainly good, but they weren't necessarily memorable quite yet. And I think a lot of that just comes down to overall confidence and understanding that control. He didn't quite have that control of his voice quite yet, and that needed time to develop. And this is also kind of why I think his part in Side Effects didn't go viral, and his part in God's Menu did. With God's Menu, they kind of shifted it from being just a guy with a deep voice to being at the center of it. I think his part in God's Menu was written to focus right on him. It was a very loud song, very aggressive, very continued song, and then following that chorus, they drop right down into his part, where the instruments almost go entirely away. And now that he understood that contrast and how to control it better, he was able to elevate the song like they had hoped for him to do. That's the moment that let him obviously explode Stray Kids and also show that Sriracha understands what they're doing with Felix. This moment gives the audience a bit of a breather from the aggressive intro and chorus. It clicks in the brain that something different is happening now. You can feel the shift from the louder stuff down to that quieter stuff where Felix is right at the center with his voice, that interesting point, and he's controlling it exceptionally well. What I also find interesting is that God's Menu was not at all his deepest instance of his voice. We had obviously Victory Song, which was much lower, Side Effects was much lower, but it didn't quite hit the same in those songs. I think that it's less about having such a low voice and actually having it structured around his voice. The song needs to be leaning into it a little bit more, where it feels like something actually shifting and you can feel that development within him. That's actually kind of why I would say there's almost 3 pillars to Felix's voice, where there's the contrast and the dynamics of that. Take for example like Maniac or Domino, or even a solo song Deep End, where you start with something louder and then Felix gets the control of the lower portion. Or in the case of Deep End, it's actually him. He's actually contrasting himself with the brighter voice and then his actual deeper voice that he's most known for. Essentially what he's doing is he's controlling the shape of the song. We can physically see this happening online. If you go on YouTube and look at the actual song music videos, we see in Maniac, the most replayed portion is his part. We could see that highlighted by the graph. Right as he comes in, there's a huge spike in people looking back. A lot of people want to go back and hear his part, not because of how deep his voice is, but because of how it comes in and how it shifts from how it was before. Domino, you can't see it as well because Domino doesn't have a music video, but there's definitely a bit of a spike going up there. It's a little bit harder to see since it is such a short video, but that alone highlights his contrast and how not only he understands, but how Sriracha understands how to contrast with his voice. I think that had Maniac began with the louder chorus and not actually dropped down after that pre-chorus, it wouldn't have hit as hard. It's important that Felix gets the more lower end kind of portions where he can use that contrast. He can take the energy that was high and drop it down immediately. That's what gets your attention, and that's what keeps you listening and keeps you hooked. The second main pillar I would consider him to have is obviously identity. He's kind of the sound of Stray Kids now. I mean, you could talk about the deep voice in K-pop and pretty much everyone will recognize that as Felix. He's got that identity down where people just understand him as that, but not because he's got the lowest voice in K-pop, but because he's able to control it and use it in a way that obviously contrasts, like I said before, but expands on his own personal identity. On the same album as Ordinary, they use it again pretty well. I'd say in Charmer, his part in the second verse is great. You go from kind of a faster flow and rap to much of a slower and paced down portion for Felix. And that allows you to feel a big change coming. You feel something hitting without there actually being much hitting. It's kind of nothing that hits you, but somehow that nothing hits so hard. I would honestly argue that Stray Kids' signature sound is built around him, where I wonder if Maniac would have never been written had he not been in the group. What do I mean by that? I think that Maniac was intended to have that low portion in the chorus. Had Felix not been in the group and not inspired them to take something like that with such a low voice, I don't think it would have ever happened. Now, look, I could be wrong. I'm not Sriracha. I really do think that without Felix in the group, it wouldn't have hit as hard, obviously, and it probably wouldn't have ever been written. I think that Felix's voice and understanding what they can do with that voice inspires a lot of their songs. Not so much about like, oh, well, Felix's voice inspired the entire concept of Maniac. I don't mean that much entirely, but like the actual structure of the song is kind of what comes down to his voice. I think that loops back to God's Menu as well, where had Felix not been in the group, had he not had that very low aspect to his voice, they might not have put in something quite like that in the song. And it's because of those two things, his contrast and also his personal identity, that allows for his third pillar, which is memorability. His parts aren't standalone things. They're things that people will remember even after they hear it the first time. Dare I even say they remember it seconds after. They're thinking back to that part that just happened even while the song is still progressing. This is something that people have called the Felix effect, where Felix's voice or his just personality in general attract people immensely. He's probably the biggest member of Stray Kids for actually attracting in new audiences, where people just notice him so quickly and latch onto him so much more. And that's not to say that the other members don't have their own qualities, but Felix has his down in a way that expands on what Stray Kids is. His own qualities are built into the group on their own. What makes it work even better is that you like that one part of MANIAC? Oh, well, good for you. We have 5 other songs that have a similar structure where we highlight his voice in that same way. Oh, you love those songs now? Perfect, good. Now you're gonna listen to my music and now you're gonna buy my album. So it all kind of snowballs into something where he's bringing them in based on the sound that Stray Kids have developed, and he's also expanding it on his own. And I think that's what let Stray Kids elevate their noise so much. It gave almost a balance to it, where it gave them something they can bench on if they ever get a little bit too loud with their sound. Say the chorus they want is very explosive, but they don't want it to be too in your face, just enough that people will recognize it and be able to listen to it enough, but also give it something extra, something memorable too, leading up to it even more. And so truthfully, Stray Kids' sound couldn't evolve had Felix not evolved first. Had Felix stuck with just the simpler tones, and also 3 just stuck with not layering the voice, it wouldn't have worked in quite the same way that it does now. One last thing that I find kind of interesting, I don't know how important it actually is, but like, I find it very interesting that Felix looks like this, and then his voice is very deep. So it's a very large surprise for when you're finding out about him and you see him for the first time, because it doesn't match. Again, it comes back to that contrast. Like, there's something right about his appearance and his voice that grabs you in. It takes you deeper to learning more about him. You don't stop at just hearing his voice and thinking it's amazing, you also learn more about him, and I think that's kind of what's grown him to the success that he has on his own, but also within Stray Kids. I think that he's become the face of Stray Kids because of his voice and because of what he's learned. And so if you want to hear more about how Felix actually became the face of Stray Kids and how he's expanded that image, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching. Bye 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 bye.